The classroom door slammed shut, and every head snapped toward the sound. A boy, no older than 14, stood there, his violin case clutched like a shield. His name was Jamal, and today, he was about to face a storm he didn't see coming. The air in room 204 was already heavy with the scent of chalk dust and old wood when Jamal walked in. It was the kind of place where dreams either took root or withered under scrutiny. Mrs. Hargrove, the music teacher, stood at the front, her lips pursed, her eyes scanning the new faces in her advanced strings class. She was known for her precision, her high standards, and, some whispered, her biases. The room buzzed with nervous energy as students tuned their instruments, but Jamal felt the weight of every glance. He was the only black student in the class, and the whispers had started the moment he enrolled. "All right, settle down," Mrs. Hargrove barked, her voice cutting through the chatter. "We're here to make music, not noise. Let's see what you've got." Her eyes landed on Jamal, lingering a beat too long. "You, new boy. What's your name?" "Jamal Carter, ma'am," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "Jamal," she repeated, her tone clipped, as if testing the word. "And you think you belong in this class?" A few students snickered, their laughter like needles pricking his skin. Jamal's grip tightened on his violin case, but he kept his chin high. "I know I do," he said, meeting her gaze. Mrs. Hargrove's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We'll see about that. Play something. Impress me." The challenge hung in the air, sharp and cold. The other students shifted in their seats, sensing the tension. Some leaned forward, curious, others smirked, expecting failure. Jamal opened his case, revealing a scratched but well-loved violin. It wasn't much to look at, not like the polished instruments the others held, but it was his. He'd learned on it, pouring hours into practice in his cramped apartment, where the walls were thin and the neighbors complained about the noise. Music was his escape, his rebellion against a world that often told him he didn't belong. He lifted the violin to his shoulder, the bow trembling slightly in his hand. Not from fear, but from the fire building inside him. He chose Vivaldi's Spring from the Four Seasons, a piece that demanded precision and soul. The first note rang out, clear and vibrant, slicing through the room's skepticism. Mrs. Hargrove's smirk faltered. The music poured from Jamal like a river breaking free. His fingers danced across the strings, each note a defiance, each phrase a story. The classroom, once restless, fell silent. Students who'd laughed now stared, mouth slightly open. Even Sarah, the star cellist who'd rolled her eyes when Jamal walked in, leaned forward, her bow forgotten in her lap. But Mrs. Hargrove wasn't swayed. Halfway through the piece, she raised a hand. "Enough," she said, her voice sharp. "You're playing it all wrong. Too much emotion. This isn't a street performance." The room froze. Jamal's bow stopped, the final note hanging unfinished. His chest heaved, and he felt the sting of her words like a slap. "Wrong?" he said, his voice low but steady. "I played every note right." "Right?" Mrs. Hargrove laughed, a short, brittle sound that echoed off the walls. "You think you can waltz in here, with that instrument, and show off? This is a place for discipline, not flair." The word flair landed like an accusation, and Jamal knew what she meant. It wasn't about the music. It was about him, his skin, his presence, the audacity of his talent. The other students shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others glaring at Mrs. Hargrove. Sarah's face tightened, her fingers twitching as if she wanted to say something but didn't. "I can play it better than anyone here," Jamal said, his voice rising. "Give me a chance." Mrs. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "You think you're special? Prove it. Play Bach's Partita No. 2. The Chaconne. Right now." The room gasped. The Chaconne was a beast of a piece, a marathon of technical and emotional depth that even seasoned professionals approached with caution. It was a test designed to break him. Jamal's heart pounded, but he didn't flinch. He knew the piece. He'd practiced it late into the night, his mother's tired eyes watching proudly from the couch. He adjusted his stance, took a deep breath, and began. The first notes were tentative, searching, like a voice finding its strength. Then they grew, weaving a tapestry of sound that filled the room. The chaconne was a conversation with history, each phrase building on the last, demanding everything from the player heart, mind, and soul. Jamal gave it all. His eyes closed, his body swayed, and the violin sang with a clarity that made the air hum. Mrs. Hargrove's face changed. Her smirk was gone, replaced by something unreadable: shock, maybe, or disbelief. The students were transfixed. Sarah's eyes glistened, her earlier disdain replaced by awe. Even Tyler, the class bully who'd muttered slurs under his breath, sat silent, his hands still. But the tension wasn't over. As Jamal reached the piece's climax, Mrs. Hargrove stepped forward, her voice cutting through the music like a blade. "Stop," she shouted. "You're not doing it right. You're too aggressive. This isn't your music." The words hit harder than any note. Jamal's bow froze, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "My music," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "This is everyone's music. Bach didn't write it for you to gatekeep." A murmur rippled through the class. Sarah stood up, her chair scraping loudly. "He's right," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Jamal's playing was incredible. Why are you so hard on him?" Mrs. Hargrove's face reddened. "Sit down, Sarah. This isn't your place." "It's all our place," Sarah shot back. "You're not being fair." The room erupted. Students began talking over each other, some defending Jamal, others siding with Mrs. Hargrove out of fear or habit. Tyler shouted something ugly, and another student told him to shut up. The classroom was a powder keg, and Jamal stood at the center, his violin still in hand, his heart racing. He could have walked away. He could have let the anger consume him, let the injustice win. But Jamal wasn't built that way. He raised his bow again, and without a word, he began to play. Not Bach this time, but something Newa melody he'd written himself, born from nights of frustration and hope. It was raw, haunting, a cry and a celebration all at once. The room fell silent again, the arguments fading as the music took over. It was as if Jamal's violin was speaking for him, telling a story of struggle and resilience, of a boy who refused to be defined by others' prejudices. Mrs. Hargrove stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. Sarah's eyes were wet, and even Tyler looked away, his bravado crumbling. When the final note faded, the silence was deafening. Then, slowly, Sarah began to clap. One by one, the others joined her, until the room was filled with applause. Mrs. Hargrove didn't move, her face a mask of conflicting emotions: anger, shame, maybe even a flicker of respect. Jamal lowered his violin, his chest heaving. "I'm not here to prove myself to you," he said, looking straight at Mrs. Hargrove. "I'm here to play. And I'm not going anywhere." The bell rang, sharp and jarring, but no one moved. The moment hung heavy, a turning point no one could ignore. Jamal had laid bare the truth: talent doesn't care about color, and music doesn't bend to prejudice. But the fight was far from over. As the students filed out, Sarah caught up with Jamal in the hallway. "That was unbelievable," she said, her voice soft. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner." Jamal nodded, still processing the weight of what had happened. "It's okay. Just don't stay quiet next time." She smiled, a little sad but determined. "I won't." Back in the classroom, Mrs. Hargrove stood alone, staring at the chalkboard where someone had written, "Harmony in Diversity." Her hands trembled as she erased it, but the words lingered in her mind. She'd been wrong about Jamal, about herself, and the realization was a bitter pill. The next day, Jamal returned to class, his violin case in hand. The whispers were quieter now, the glances less hostile. Mrs. Hargrove avoided his eyes, but she didn't stop him when he took his seat. The room felt different, like a storm had passed but left the air clearer. Over the weeks, Jamal's playing became the heart of the class. His talent wasn't just a gift, it was a bridge. Students who'd once ignored him now asked for his help with tricky passages. Sarah became his closest ally, her cello weaving harmonies with his violin. Even Tyler, after a grudging apology, started to listen. Mrs. Hargrove never apologized outright, but her actions changed. She stopped singling Jamal out, started critiquing his work with the same rigor she gave everyone else. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And for Jamal, that was enough for now. The school's spring concert loomed, a chance for the strings class to perform for the whole town. Jamal was chosen for a solo, a decision Mrs. Hargrove announced with a tight nod. The piece? His own composition, the one he'd played in that charged moment in class. He called it Rise, a title that carried every ounce of his journey. The night of the concert, the auditorium was packed. Jamal stood backstage, his heart pounding, his violin warm in his hands. He thought of his mother, working double shifts to afford his lessons, of the neighbors who'd banged on the walls, of Mrs. Hargrove's laughter and the classmates who'd doubted him. He thought of the music that had carried him through it all. When he stepped onto the stage, the spotlight was blinding, but he didn't flinch. He raised his bow, and Rise filled the air, a melody that spoke of pain, of triumph, of a boy who refused to be silenced. The audience leaned forward, caught in the spell of his music. Mrs. Hargrove, seated in the front row, watched in silence, her face unreadable but her eyes fixed on him. As the final note rang out, the crowd erupted. Jamal stood still, letting the applause wash over him. He didn't smile, didn't bow. He just stood there, a boy and his violin, undeniable. In that moment, he wasn't just playing for himself. He was playing for every kid who'd been told they didn't belong, every dream dismissed, every voice silenced. His music was a promise, no matter the odds, no matter the hate, he would rise. And so would they. The applause lingered, a wave of sound that seemed to hold Jamal upright. He stepped off the stage, his violin still warm against his palm, and was met by his mother's arms. She was there in the wings, her eyes shining with tears and pride. "You did it, baby," she whispered, her voice thick. "You showed them all." Jamal nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, not just the performance, but everything it represented. He'd walked into a room that didn't want him, faced a teacher who'd laughed at him, and turned their doubt into silence. But the victory wasn't sweet. It was heavy, layered with the knowledge that he shouldn't have had to fight so hard to be seen. Backstage, Sarah rushed up, her cello case bouncing against her hip. "Jamal, that was, I don't even have words," she said, her face flushed. "You made everyone feel something. Even Mrs. Hargrove." Jamal glanced toward the auditorium, where Mrs. Hargrove was still seated, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't joined the standing ovation, but she hadn't left either. "I don't know about that," he said quietly. "She's still not on my side." "She will be," Sarah said, her voice firm. "She has to be, after that." But Jamal wasn't so sure. Change didn't come that easily, not when it was rooted in something deeper than a single performance. He'd seen it in Mrs. Hargrove's eyes that first day, the way she looked at him, not as a student, but as an outsider. He'd felt it in the snickers, the whispers, the way Tyler's slurs had slipped out like they were nothing. Music could move people, but it couldn't erase history. Not yet. The weeks after the concert were different, though. The school felt less like a battlefield. Students who'd once ignored Jamal now nodded at him in the halls. Some even stopped to talk, asking about his music, his violin, how he'd learned to play like that. Tyler, surprisingly, kept his distance, his usual bravado muted. Jamal heard through Sarah that Tyler's older brother, a college freshman, had chewed him out after the concert, calling him out for his behavior. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. Mrs. Hargrove's classes took on a new tone. She was still strict, still demanding, but her critiques of Jamal were less personal. She focused on his technique now, pointing out missed dynamics or rushed tempos, the same way she did with everyone else. Once, she even nodded after he played a particularly tricky passage, a small gesture that felt like a crack in her armor. Jamal didn't trust it fully learned not to, but he noticed. Outside of class, Jamal's world expanded. His performance had caught the attention of the local music community, and an invitation came to play at a regional youth orchestra showcase. It was a big deal, a chance to perform alongside other talented kids from across the state. His mother cried when she read the letter, and Jamal couldn't help but grin, even as his nerves churned. The showcase was held in a grand concert hall, all polished wood and velvet seats, a far cry from the cramped school auditorium. Jamal arrived early, his violin case in hand, feeling out of place among the other musicians. They were mostly older, mostly white, and their instruments gleamed under the stage lights. But when he warmed up, heads turned. His sound rich, raw, unmistakable cut through the chatter. The conductor, a wiry man named Mr. Ellison, approached him before the rehearsal. "Jamal Carter, right?" he said, his eyes kind but sharp. "I heard about your solo. Let's see if you live up to the hype." Jamal nodded, his throat tight. He didn't need to prove himself again, but he knew he would. It was just how things were. The rehearsal was grueling, but Jamal held his own. He was assigned the principal's second violin chair, a role that demanded precision and leadership. The other musicians watched him closely, some with curiosity, others with skepticism. But by the end of the day, the skepticism had softened. His playing spoke for him, just as it always had. Back at school, the ripple effects of Jamal's performance continued. Sarah started a music club, inviting Jamal to co-lead. They met after school in room 204, turning the once tense space into a haven for creativity. Kids from all grades joined some with instruments, others just to listen. They played everything from classical to jazz to Jamal's own compositions, blending styles in a way that felt like freedom. One afternoon, as the club wrapped up, Mrs. Hargrove lingered at the door. She didn't step inside, but she watched, her arms crossed. Jamal caught her eye and nodded, a small acknowledgement. She nodded back, then turned and left. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The real test came at the end of the semester, when the school announced a community outreach program. The strings class was to perform at a local community center in a neighborhood like Jamal's gritty, underfunded, full of kids who didn't get chances like this. Mrs. Hargrove was tasked with leading the project, and she surprised everyone by asking Jamal to help choose the repertoire. "You know what resonates," she said, her voice gruff but lacking its usual edge. "Pick something that'll speak to them." Jamal was stunned but didn't hesitate. He chose a mix of pieces, some classical, to show the kids what was possible, and some of his own, to show them they could create something of their own. He also suggested inviting the community center kids to join the performance, even if they'd never touched an instrument before. Mrs. Hargrove raised an eyebrow but didn't say no. "Fine," she said. "But you're teaching them." The weeks leading up to the community concert were chaos. Jamal spent hours at the center, teaching kids how to hold a violin, how to feel the rhythm even if they couldn't play a note. Some were shy, others skeptical, but they all listened when he played. He saw himself in them, their hunger, their doubt, their need to be seen. One kid, a wiry 11-year-old named Marcus, reminded Jamal of himself the most. Marcus was quick to laugh but quicker to anger, his defenses up against a world that had already let him down. "Why should I care about this violin stuff?" Marcus asked one day, arms crossed. Jamal didn't answer right away. Instead, he played a short, fiery piece he'd written after a particularly bad day. When he finished, Marcus was quiet, his eyes wide. Because it's yours, Jamal said. No one can take it from you. Not when you play like that. Marcus didn't pick up a violin that day, but he came back. And the next time, he tried. The community concert was nothing like the school's polished events. The community center's gym was packed with folding chairs, crying babies, and buzzing fluorescent lights. But when the music started, the room transformed. Jamal led the group in his composition, Rise, and the community center kids joined in some on borrowed instruments, others clapping or singing along. The audience, a mix of parents, neighbors, and curious passers-by, leaned in, their faces alive with pride and wonder. Mrs. Hargrove stood at the back, conducting with a focus Jamal hadn't seen before. She wasn't warm, wasn't smiling, but she was there, giving everything to the music. When the final note faded, the gym erupted in cheers. Marcus, standing next to Jamal, grinned for the first time all night. Afterward, as the crowd milled around, Mrs. Hargrove approached Jamal. "You did well," she said, her voice low. "Those kids, they needed this." Jamal met her gaze. "They needed someone to believe in them," he said, not accusing, just stating the truth. She nodded, her lips tight. "Maybe I'm learning," she said, then walked away before he could respond. The concert became a turning point. The school's music program grew, with more kids from Jamal's neighborhood joining. Sarah's music club became a fixture, a place where differences didn't divide but united. Jamal's compositions started to spread, shared online by classmates and picked up by local radio. He wasn't just a kid with a violin anymore, he was a voice, a force. But the bigger change was quieter. It was in the way Mrs. Hargrove began to teach, with less judgment and more openness. It was in Tyler, who stopped muttering slurs and started listening. It was in Marcus, who kept coming to the community center, his own violin now tucked under his arm. It was in Jamal's mother, who no longer had to fight so hard to get him opportunities. Jamal kept playing, kept writing, kept rising. He knew the world wasn't fixed, that prejudice didn't vanish with one song. But he also knew music could crack open hearts, could make people see each other, if only for a moment. And that was enough to keep going. As he stood on the community center steps one evening, watching kids spill out with their instruments, Jamal felt the weight of his journey. He'd faced laughter, doubt, and hate, but he'd turned it into sound, into something beautiful. He'd shown the Mrs. Hargrove, his classmates, the world that talent didn't care about color, and neither should they. What do you think? Can one person's courage change a community's heart, or is the fight for justice too big for one voice? Share your thoughts, because every perspective matters in this ongoing story of right, wrong, and redemption.